When I was a kid, we had a dog whose name was Snoopy, and Snoopy was as good a dog as he could be, but Snoopy was an outside dog for us, and to the best of my knowledge, he effectively never came into our house. And as much as we loved Snoopy, the experience of him being an outside dog is very different from us with our little dog Flower Pot, because when a dog lives in the house with you, they feel altogether more like they are a part of the family, don't they? And so I loved Snoopy, but we really love Flower Pot. She's very much a part of our life and part of our family. But it's a double-edged sword having an animal, specifically having a dog in the house, isn't it? Because there's some obligations that come with having an animal in the house, and that is that regularly throughout the day you need to get them outside of the house, right? And sometimes that's a real pain. Sometimes it's a hassle and an aggravation, but sometimes it's a real experience and frustration. Those of you who are dog owners who live inside, or you have had a dog that lives inside, the scenario I'm getting ready to describe is one it's likely you can identify with. It's December the 10th. It's 34 degrees outside, just above freezing, and it's raining. It's 7:30 at night. It's been dark for 2 hours. And Flower Pot, it's time for her to go outside. So you get Flower Pot, and she doesn't want to go outside. Why? Because it's wet, and it's 34 degrees. Why don't you want to go outside? Because it's wet, and it's 34 degrees. But the dog needs to go outside. And so you pick her up, you set her outside, and finally she gets outside, and what does she start doing? Sniffing around. For moments? No. Forever. This is my question. Like people think about, when we get to heaven, what are you going to ask God about? One of the things that's on my list is, what are dogs smelling for? Are they looking for something really good or something really bad? I can't tell. But I'm standing out there, it's raining, I didn't go get an umbrella, I'm just trying to stay under the eave of the house, and the dog keeps sniffing around, looking for the perfect place, and I'm like, just please hurry up, it's cold, it's dark, it's wet, it's time to go in the house, it's time to take care of business so that we can get back inside. I get frustrated, why? Because something needs to happen and nothing is happening. Something needs to happen and nothing is happening. Now that type of experience we regularly encounter in life. And more specifically, it is something that unfortunately we struggle with as those that are the followers of Christ, where we believe that something should be happening and something isn't happening. We experience these frustrations as followers of Christ. And let me give you a specific demonstration of this. Sometimes in your relationship with God, you're going to experience frustration, sometimes even anger or disappointment. When you're going through your experience of difficulty, I mean, you feel like you're on your own personal griddle, and you've looked toward heaven and said, okay, God, here's my circumstance, here's my problem, and what's going on? Nothing. You been there? Done that? Got the t-shirt? Well, when you're going through that, and when it seems like something needs to happen and nothing is happening, you can get frustrated. Unfortunately, you can develop cracks in your faith, and all that stuff is lousy. So what do? We're thinking about this through the lens of a series in the book of Habakkuk. And while that's not the most famous or well-known book in the Bible, it is describing a whole series of experiences that are nothing new, where we experience frustration or anxiety or disappointment or sometimes even anger with God when He doesn't do things in ways that we think He ought to do. And today we're thinking about this specific question. How is it that I should respond when it doesn't seem like God is doing anything? I've got my problem, I've told Him about my problem, but God isn't doing anything. Look with me in your Bibles today to Habakkuk chapter 2. Habakkuk chapter 2, and we're going to look at the first 3 verses. Habakkuk chapter 2, starting with verse 1. You can read in your Bible or follow along on the screen where we read these words. Habakkuk is talking here, and he says, I will stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. I will watch to see what he will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. The Lord answered me, write down this vision, clearly inscribe it on tablets so one may easily read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. Now I realize, and you're probably realizing as well, we're not reading a complete thought here, but in these words here, I believe we get the answer to our question, which again is this: how is it, as a follower of Christ, I should respond when I've gone to Him with my difficulty and it doesn't seem like God is doing anything? Here's the first response based on what Habakkuk does, and that's this. I believe God wants us to talk to Him instead of about Him. When it seems like God isn't doing anything, talk to Him instead of about Him. Now, I'm not going to bore you with 2 weeks of review so that we can rehash everything that we've talked about since the beginning of this month, but just so that we're on the same page, let me just set the stage for you. Habakkuk is the prophet of God, and he is being used by God to speak to the Lord's people, but he's also speaking to the Lord on behalf of God's people in the southern kingdom in Judah. And what's going on is that the people of Judah have gotten to a point where, by and large, as the people of God, they don't act like the people of God. They're not looking like the people of God. They look like reprobates. They look like people that are following pagan gods. They look like the rest of their neighbors. They're not demonstrating any difference that any difference that God makes in the life of a person or a family at all. And so Habakkuk looks and he's like, well, this is a problem. We're the people of God, and look at all this injustice, this violence, this idolatry, this immorality, all this stuff. This is a problem. And thankfully, he does the right thing. When there's a problem, what does he want to do? He wants to see something happen to fix the problem. And so he says, hey, God, are you paying attention to this? Do you realize what's going on? All this bad stuff, and it's time that this needs to be addressed. I see it's a problem. My hope is you're seeing this, you're paying attention, and that you somehow see that it's a problem. And God lets Habakkuk in on the fact that he is up to something and that he is doing something. And even though Habakkuk doesn't have all the details, and he says to him, listen, if I had told you what I was going to do, you wouldn't even have believed it. So even though it looked like I'm oblivious, I'm not. I'm actually working. I'm actually doing stuff. And he goes on to describe what's getting ready to happen, that God is going to send the Babylonians in, this pagan enemy nation, with their mighty armies and their swift chariots and their massive armament to come in, and they're going to sack Jerusalem. They're going to overthrow the southern kingdom. And all these people that are the people of God are going to wind up being the people of Babylon. That's what's getting ready to happen. And so hearing this, all that leads us up to verse 1 of chapter 2, where Habakkuk has said, okay, God, there's a problem, something needs to happen, and God says, okay, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something. And what does Habakkuk say? He says, I'm going to stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. I'm going to stand here and look to see what's happening. And as Habakkuk looks out on the horizon, what does he see? Nothing. What does he hear? Crickets. There's a problem. I've gone to you. I've said something needs to happen. You said, hey, something's going to happen, but nothing's happening. He says, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to watch and see what's going to happen, what he's going to do. And then he says, I will watch to see what he's going to say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. So, what is Habakkuk's frustration at this point? It's one that's possible you've experienced. And that is, you've got the difficulty and God doesn't seem to be doing anything. And it's possible that you have already found yourself in that specific scenario. Maybe you're sitting here this morning personally identifying with that scenario. So what do? I think we follow Habakkuk's example, which is this. Decide you're going to talk to God instead of about Him. You say, well, I don't quite get that. What are you saying by that? Let me ask it this way. How many times is it that when you have some sort of difficulty, some sort of challenge with a person, it could be a spouse, it could be a child, it could be a boss, it could be a coworker, it could be a church member, it could be whoever it is. And most of the time, when we have difficulty with someone, most of the time, what do we tend to do? We tend to go and talk to somebody else about that person, don't we? You wouldn't believe this. Let me tell you what they did recently. Let me just tell you about this last conversation. And we keep describing this mounting series of difficulties, all these problems that we have had, all these occurrences that have grieved us, that have frustrated us, that have angered us. instead of what? Instead of talking to the person with whom we've got the challenge. Instead of talking to the person with whom we've got the problem. And when Habakkuk has the challenge, hey, God, there's this stuff that's going on, there's this problem, you don't find Habakkuk going to other people and saying, I can't believe that God is doing this. I am so frustrated. God, I don't even know that He's good. I don't know that He is powerful. I don't know that He's got the resources. I don't believe maybe He's got the wherewithal, maybe He's got the heart, maybe He's got the courage. I don't get it. He doesn't go and complain to anybody else. He's got a problem, and his beef is with God, and instead of going to others to talk about God, what does he do? He goes and talks to God. Just recently, I went to Super Walmart, which is, in my life, I kind of view that as a necessary evil. And you might experience that same feeling. I don't like this one in particular. Maybe there's better ones in town, but I don't like going to this one over here on Wendover. But it's close, and there's so much stuff that we need at Walmart, and so I go there. Now, I went there, and I'm telling you, I thought a miracle had happened. I get in the front door, and I go and I grab a buggy. And the blessed thing worked. It didn't have one flat wheel or with a flat spot on it. It didn't have like hair wrapped around one of the casters. And I think this is what's going on. They wait until there are no shopping carts at all in the store. They're all out in the parking lot, and then somebody comes with one of those little battery-powered things with a line of buggies that goes from here to Atlanta, and they're trying to drag those things into the building, and what it does, it bends all those front casters. And so you're trying to push your cart, and you always go to the... Isn't that frustrating? It's terrible. It's terrible. And so I walk in, and I'm like, are you kidding? This is a new shopping cart. It rolls smoothly. The casters, they're not bent. Angels were singing. And the greeter is there, and I said to him, man, I am so glad you've got new shopping carts. And he said, you need to tell the manager because I've been hearing it from people for 2 years. Now, why did he say that to me? It's pretty simple. He said, I want you to tell the manager. You know why? Because the manager can do something about it. The manager can do stuff about the challenge, about the problem that the greeter simply can't. Now, when you and I have a difficulty, when you've got your beef with God, whether it's legitimate or otherwise, whether it's perceived or actual, whatever your difficulty is, I'm telling you, God's big enough to deal with your frustrations. He's big enough to deal with your challenges. He's big enough to deal with your frustrations and your questions. And I'm telling you, if you start just going to other people and saying, man, I can't believe God's doing this, or I'm so frustrated God's not doing that, what use is that? Of what benefit is there going to be that comes from that? I'm telling you, zero, zilch, nada. Do you know why? Because they can't do anything about it. It's like talking to the greeter about the buggies. The greeter can't do anything. The co-worker, the boss, the fellow classmate, the Sunday school teacher, the preacher, whoever it is, I'm telling you, if your problem is with God, I can't fix that. And so instead of talking to me about God, why don't you talk to God about God? And so, if you are experiencing difficulty, frustration, that God isn't responding, and it doesn't seem like He's doing anything, well, talk to God instead of about Him. Second thing I think we need to do, and that's this: remember the link between frustration and perspective. Remember the link between frustration and perspective. What does that mean? Pay attention to what's going on here. Habakkuk has just said, all right, I'm going to stand here and wait to see what happens. And then figure out how I'm going to reply to what he says about my complaint. Verse 2, we're told the Lord answers. And so God begins to respond, and this is the response. He says, Habakkuk, I want you to write down what I'm getting ready to say. And says, in fact, he says, I want you to inscribe it on tablets, big tablets, so that somebody even walking by can read it. So big letters. I want Helen Keller to be able to know what's going on here. All right? So I'll write it big letters that everyone can read it. But then he says, this that is coming is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end, and it will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it. Pay attention to what he says in verse 3. What I'm getting ready to describe, he says what? He says it testifies about what? About the end. This is talking about something that is down the road. And secondly, that it delays. Now, I want you to think about the specifics going on here for a moment, then we'll think about the application. What God is getting ready to describe, and you can go back, and we didn't read it today, but you could briefly even peruse chapter 2. And what God is beginning to describe is how the Babylonians are going to get squashed like a bug. And so Habakkuk's problem is, he says, okay, God, the people, your people, we're a mess. We're acting like we're godless, and something needs to happen. And God says something's going to happen. The Babylonians are going to come in, and I'm going to use them as an instrument of judgment on you to get your attention, to draw you back to me. And Habakkuk's like, wait a minute, time out, time out. Those people are really bad. I mean, we're bad, but they're really bad. How can you use people that are worse off than we are? I mean, these are awful people. They're nasty, despicable. Are you kidding me? So they're going to get a pass? And so God begins to describe, no, they're not going to get a pass. And so what's going to happen is that they are going to be brought down, that their hubris and pride is going to be brought down to terrifying suffering and misery, that their chariots, that their mighty armies, that their massive power, that their self-confidence, that being at the top of the ladder, they're going to be brought down to the bottom. And so as that happens, God says before it, He says, this is going to happen, but it is yet for an appointed time, and that it delays. You say, okay, well, Michael, what does that have to do with me? I'm not getting overtaken by the Babylonians or anybody else. I don't know, what does this have to do with me? Understand this, Habakkuk is frustrated with God because he doesn't like that nothing seems to be going on. When God says something is going to go on and it's not to his liking, I'm going to deal with the Babylonians, and I'm going to deal with them, and it's going to be really bad for them in the end. But it's not going to happen right now. It's further down the road. What's he communicating? He's communicating very simply this, that Habakkuk can't see what is around the corner. In fact, it's not simply that he can't see what's around the corner. He absolutely can't see what is down the road. What I'm trying to say is that God is saying to him, you can't see what I see. That your perspective is really, really small. Your perspective is really, really limited. What does that have to do with us? Think about it this way. It is interesting to me the change in perspective in my lifetime with respect to skin care. Like, for example, I think about when I was a kid, I don't know, May, somewhere around that time. That's when, nobody was talking about sunscreen. And if you did use sunscreen, it was either baby oil or something that had like SPF 2 or 4. We might as well have been putting butter on our arms. And so, but I don't know about you, but I was encouraged as a kid to go out and begin the summer by getting what? A base tan. Did anybody? So a few of you had bad parents as well. And so, no. Anyway, so go out and get a base tan, which essentially was this. Go get burnt early so that maybe you won't get burnt as bad later. And so, but that was the encouragement. We weren't wearing sunscreen, and we were just getting scalded by the sun every summer. Now, that's very different from what it's like today. Today, like with our kids, we buy sunscreen in like a 50-gallon drum, right? And but when I was a kid, it was like SPF 2. Now we're using something like SPF 250. We'll walk around putting them in the shade. Like for me, my bald head, I always wear a hat if I'm outside. I've got sunglasses on. I'm spraying myself down every year. I go to the dermatologist, and they look at this, and already they're cutting stuff off. Some of you have been there, stuff that if left unchecked is going to become a real problem. It's a vastly different world now, isn't it? But why the difference? I think it's just kind of simply this. Years ago, it's like we didn't really know what all that was going to do. It's like we were oblivious to what was going to be happening in the years to come. That I'm getting stuff cut off now because I was doing dumb stuff back then, but I just didn't know. I wasn't aware. I couldn't see what was going to happen. And so, like, now I can look back and say, well, what were you thinking? Well, why were we doing this? But what I'm trying to communicate is this, that my frustration is linked to what? To the limited perspective that I had. Consistently, as a follower of Christ, you are going to find yourself sometimes beating your head against the wall. And you're saying, God, I don't get it. It certainly looks like nothing is going on. And what's the matter? I mean, do you not see this is a problem? This is causing me real heartache. I'm experiencing sleepless nights. I'm experiencing tears coming down my eyes. I'm going through all this. Are you not going to do anything? What's going on? It looks like absolutely nothing. Keep in mind, as you are going through that, there is absolutely a link, an inextricable link between frustration and perspective. The smaller your perspective is, the greater your frustration is going to be. Let me just remind you how much it is that you and I are able to see. That much. I know what has happened just to me and just in my 46 and a half years. That's it. What's going to happen tomorrow? Well, I've got some hopes and plans, some expectations, but I don't really know what's going to happen. What's going to happen on the way home? What's going to happen on the way home for you? I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea. I have no idea. And the more limited your perspective, the greater the odds are for you to experience frustration. And as you are wrestling or struggling with, God, I don't get this, and I'm just so frustrated and angry, I'm so disappointed. Why aren't you doing anything? You need to do a self-evaluation and say, wait a minute, what all does Michael know? Very little. What all does Michael see? Very little. And if I can keep that in mind, hopefully it begins to keep my frustration in check. Where I say, you know what? You see what I don't. You know what I don't. How should I respond when God doesn't seem to be doing anything? The last thing I want you to see is this. Understand you cannot make God things happen. Understand you can't make God things happen. In verse 3, God tells Habakkuk that he's getting ready to give them a glimpse of the things that are going to be occurring, things that are down the road. But notice the middle statement in verse 3. He says, though it delays, wait for it, for it will certainly come about and not be late. A few things you need to notice about that statement. First of all, God uses the word late. Late is an adjective to describe timing, isn't it? Late says that something is occurring at a time beyond when it should have occurred. And so God says, listen, what is going to happen is not going to occur past the time it should have occurred. But I want you to also realize that late is kind of a subjective call, isn't it? Late is a subjective call based on who's paying attention to the clock or who is determining the timing. So let me just ask you this. Who's a better judge of time, me or God? Who's a better time of judge, you or God? God is. And so God, the one that really knows how things are going to unfold and really has a sense of time, He says, what I'm going to do, it's not going to happen past the time that it should have. And then He says, though it delays, I want you to wait for it. Now that simple statement communicates a very important truth, and here it is. God was and is doing things. And when God told him to wait for it, that was an encouragement to not do what? It was an encouragement for him to not do anything. It was an encouragement for him to wait instead of acting. So, pay attention. God does not say, though it delays, I want you to figure out and scramble and see if somehow you can make something happen. He doesn't say that. He says, I am doing something, and what I'm going to do, it's not going to happen one moment beyond when it should. So trust me that I've got a proper sense of timing. Your perspective is so small, I see the big picture. Realize this. Trust me in this. And then he says, wait for it, which is an encouragement to not try to make it happen yourself. It was an encouragement to trust God to do His work instead of me assuming His prerogatives. For a little while, we owned some ducks. I told you about that. And I really like ducks. I think ducks are, they're happy animals. They really are. We had some of the white Peking ducks. I like mallard. I think mallards are really cool. I think they're funny. There's a lake in our neighborhood, and so we've got ducks and stuff around. Our neighbors are putting in a pool, and so we've seen ducks sitting over there in their pool, and it's kind of funny. I like ducks. They're interesting to watch. I think perhaps one of the reasons that I like ducks is because I feel like in some ways I can identify with them, and that if I were a bird, it's likely I would be like a duck. This is the reason I say that. Have you ever watched a duck fly? Pay attention to it next time you see it. For one thing, it's not graceful at all. It looks very panicked. Have you noticed that? That when a duck's up in the air, is there any gliding or soaring? I mean, even vultures soar, but what about ducks? Like if they stop for a second, that they're just going to nosedive into the ground. But you know what? Do you know what ducks fly like that? All ducks. Why aren't they soaring on clouds and drifting and going in and out? Because that's not what ducks do. In fact, that's something that ducks can't do. That's what ducks can do. I want you to realize that in more ways than one, we are like a duck. And how and what we can do is all we can do. I can only operate like a duck. I can only operate like Michael. I can only do what Michael can do. You know what I can't do? I can't do what God can do. You know what you can't do? You can't do what God can do. Do you know what Habakkuk could not do? Habakkuk could not do what God could do. And so he says, listen, I'm telling you, stuff is going to happen. It's down the road. You can't see it. I want you to trust me that it's not going to occur a moment past when it should be. I want you to lean on me in my sense of timing and when things are best to occur, and just wait for it. Don't try to make something happen. Why? Because you can't make God things happen. It may be that you came into this place today thinking that you've got a circumstance problem and that you're going through this difficulty and you've got this challenge and you're experiencing frustration, that you're weighed down by the difficulty of the moment. But in truth, I want you to realize that we are weighed down by the weight of a choice. You are weighed down by the weight of a choice. And the choice is this. What do you want to happen? What do you want to happen? Do you want what Michael can do? Do you want what you can do? Or do you want what God can do? Do you want something to happen right now because you think now's the best time for action? I'm telling you, if that's the case, you can have that. But you'll have to make something happen. You'll have to do what you can do, whatever that is. Or do you want God to do something? Do you want Him to do only the things that He can do? If that's the case, you're going to have to resign yourself to the fact that His understanding of timing is not simply different from, but altogether better than yours. His message is simple. Though it delays, wait for it, because it will come about and not be late. Do that, unless, of course, you want to experience what only you can do. So here's the question. What do you want to happen? What you can do or what God can do? Will you bow your heads with me?